Still,
Someone will probably have to go and have is it live now then?
We're live now.
oh, it's past. It's come and gone. I'm doing a
No, the new
Coronos.
one, I mean.
Oh no, not at all.
Okay.
I haven't created the new one yet because it's still very confusingly giving me the oh, it's doing something now. Okay, I think we're on. This may have worked.
With the same link?
Yeah.
Is it the same link? Okay.
Let me have a look. Well, I can see. Yeah, it's okay.
Is it?
Everyone watching, because we've got the 20-second delay, we don't know if it's working, and everyone's going to be like, we can see you.
Well, actually, it says live. No. Actually, it's working.
Yeah. Well, yeah. If I press play on the site, though, I can just see the 45 seconds from when Damien and I did it earlier.
It's 4 of us. So welcome, everybody. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. It was probably my fault.
No.
I wanted to test it.
Okay, it's all looking good. Well. I haven't confirmed that. Can somebody confirm that it is working? It would actually be helpful. It would be helpful if one of you could keep an eye on the YouTube chat as well, because I'm not going to be able to follow the YouTube chat and share my screen and talk about stuff and everything. So let me know if any questions or comments come up on the YouTube chat. There may not be any, but okay, excellent. Well, hello everyone. My name's James Tauber, and this is kind of a big experiment. We need, as part of the Digital Tolkien project, to come up with a citation scheme for Unfinished Tales, and I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about what that means. And normally we would just have a call, a couple of us, to discuss that, but I thought I'd experiment and actually live stream the YouTube chat. So I have with me Kiara, Damien, and Andrew. And yeah, we'll get started. I'm basically going to treat this, I think, like a chat between the 4 of us, and try to forget that there may be other people watching. And but if you do notice any comments in YouTube, please let me know, and we can address those. But let me share my screen and first of all talk a little bit about what we're doing and why. And certainly the 3 of you can feel free to chime in, but you should be able to see my slides. Okay. So we're designing a citation system for Unfinished Tales. First of all, what is the Digital Tolkien project? Just to remind people that might not be familiar, we're really just trying to take an approach to studying Tolkien's works that draws from the way that scholars take computational and philological approaches to other, particularly ancient texts. So at least in the case of Kiara and myself, we come from a background of studying classical texts, and a lot of the techniques that get used to better understand and annotate and analyze those texts are really what we're trying to bring to Tolkien studies. So this is a scholarly project. We're trying to foster as much as possible collaboration and open scholarship, although obviously there are challenges dealing with works that are still in copyright, unlike ancient texts. And so we're always mindful of respecting the rights and wishes of both the Tolkien estate and the publisher. Now, the whole overall approach with the project is to basically layer various bits of information on top of one another. At the base, we have the text itself, and getting the text right, having an accurate digital representation of the text, which includes choice of edition and occasionally making critical decisions about what text to use in certain cases. Some of our projects do care very much about differences in editions. Others just take a particular text as canonical and really focus on that text. As long as we're clear about what the text is and which text we're talking about there. So, for example, in The Hobbit, it's very important to make distinctions between editions And there's a whole range of study we could do about textual variations within the editions. But for certain more literary studies, we may just say we're going to take the latest edition. But even then, we need to have a good text. And then layered on top of that are structural decisions or indications of structure, because these works aren't just sequences of letters, they're and characters. They have a structure to them. In the most simplest case, that could just be chapters made up of paragraphs, but obviously you get things like verse as well, where stanzas are made up of lines. You get additional structures on top of that. Sometimes, obviously, Lord of the Rings is 6 books and some appendices that group the chapters in the books. You have letters and inscriptions and timelines and all sorts of other interesting textual structures in a lot of these documents. And once you have that sort of structure laid out, one of the really important things to do, which is the focus of this meeting, is a citation scheme, a way of referencing into the components of that structure. And this is particularly important with the work that we're doing, given that it's in copyright, which is a lot of the time we can't share the text. We can't transmit the text from one scholar to another, but we want to say things about that text. And in order to do that, we need to have a way of referencing a particular paragraph or a particular word or a particular section or whatever. And having a standard way of doing that is what we're working on for Unfinished Tales today. Layered on top of that, I'm not going to get into it now. We can start to do annotation and then analysis and visualization and so on. I'm sure we'll do lots more videos and discussions about that stuff. But the real focus now is on the citation. So citation systems exist for a lot of different books. The one that people are probably most familiar with is book, chapter, verse for the Bible. But there are things like Stephanus and Becker numbers for Plato and Aristotle. I'm sure Chiara has feelings about those. One of the challenges, so just to explain, I mean, the way that Plato and Aristotle are usually referenced is actually using page numbers from a particular edition many hundreds of years ago, which is actually not dissimilar to the way a lot of Tolkien scholarship is done now. If you look at a book like Complete Guide to Middle-earth, or even references in the history of Middle-earth to texts like Lord of the Rings, they're often done with a page number of a particular edition, a particular printed edition. And there's obviously challenges with tying it to a particular printed edition. If the text gets reset, then the references no longer make sense, and so on. But that still gets done for Plato and Aristotle, for better or worse. There are things like book and line numbers for the Iliad and Odyssey, and line numbers in Beowulf. So there's plenty of these sort of citation systems already, and we're just trying to develop one for Tolkien's works. I want to make a quick shout out. Well, I'll get to sort of what the existing stuff is at the moment, and give a shout out then. We do have in place a citation system for The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and Silmarillion. Although I'll clarify, because I'm sure if I don't, Andrew will bring this up. We have citation systems for very specific editions, very specific versions of the text. I don't even want to say edition, because you can have textual variations within editions. As some of you may be aware of the stuff that I've been doing on the Silmarillion, but it's even more the case with some of the other works. But we do have a basic citation system for The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion. The Lord of the Rings one has deliberately been made compatible with the work of Eric Muller-Harder and the Lord of the Rings citation system that he's developed. So the numbers actually do correspond there in terms of the way that we number paragraphs and other chunks in the Lord of the Rings text, at least the main body of the Lord of the Rings text, books 1 through 6. So we have one for The Hobbit. We came up with one for the Silmarillion quite recently. Chiara and I had a Zoom call and worked that out. You can read about those at digitaltolkien.com/citation systems. They're the citation systems that are used currently in Search Tolkien. And really the goal of that we have before us now is to deal with some of the issues with doing the same for Unfinished Tales. Unfinished Tales raises a bunch of new challenges. It's interesting from a citation system complexity point of view. The Silmarillion is actually probably the easiest, simply because the Silmarillion is pretty much just paragraphs of text. There's a tiny little bit of verse, but for the most part, it's just paragraphs in chapters. The only challenge we had with the Silmarillion was deciding what to do with the fact that there were subsections in the Valaquenta, and also there's this overarching structure of there being 5 major sections, of which the middle one, the Quenta Silmarillion, has 24 chapters. So a lot of the issues that Chiara and I discussed a few weeks ago were just dealing with those issues. But there wasn't much in the way of, is this a new paragraph? Is this a new chunk? That sort of stuff, which does come up in Lord of the Rings and to a lesser extent, The Hobbit. Unfinished Tales, though, I think is considerably more complex than those 3, in large part due to the fact that it's the first book in this sequence that has obvious editorial intervention by Christopher Tolkien that we want to call out. One of the goals here, and we were discussing it actually before the live stream started, is it's very important for us to be able to distinguish in our structure the parts that are from the Tolkien's manuscripts in various stages and what's editorial comment by Christopher. And that also is a huge issue with History of Middle-earth. And Unfinished Tales, in many respects, is much closer to History of Middle-earth in terms of the complexity of the structure and the issues that we're needing to deal with. We'll come to that very specific examples in due course. Just some principles that I've kind of noted down as we've developed these different citation schemes that we want to keep in mind. References are strictly hierarchical. So, and we use a dotted notation. So we sort of say 1.2.5 for the different hierarchy of the structure. But the way that works is that, A.B is always the concatenation of all the children. So you can always refer to a collection of lower structural elements by a prefix or a part of the reference. At the highest level, the hierarchy should map to the table of contents. So one of the things that we'll probably do for Unfinished Tales is look at the table of contents and use that as sort of the outline of the highest level of the structure. One thing that's important is that we're not just using numbers for the labels at each level. We can use anything alphanumeric, and they don't have to necessarily be sortable either. So 1.B can go before 1.A if there's a good reason to call the first child B and the second child A. There's definitely, if there's a alphanumeric label, it sometimes makes sense to use that. Although obviously if the chapter has an explicit number, then we'll just use that number. I think the biggest challenge in all of this is trying to balance consistency and logic with intuitiveness for end users. One of the things that often came up in the Silmarillion discussion that I had with Chiara is that there may be a very clean, logical way of structuring it by having extra levels and stuff like that, but it's not necessarily the way that a normal reader of the text thinks about things. And that balance between having something completely consistent and logical on the one hand and having something that's intuitive for end users is, I think, the major tension that we're facing with this work. And then I think the last thing I want to point out is just a specific example that comes up occasionally, and we decided to approach it a particular way in the Silmarillion. I think it comes up in Unfinished Tales as well. And that has to do with these top-level paragraphs. You sometimes get a situation, and in the case of the Silmarillion, this comes up in the Valaquenta. You sometimes get a situation where you have something like a chapter that's got sections in it. And each section is headed, has a heading. And so it's very obvious if you've got chapter 5, then the first section in chapter 5 is going to be 5.1, and 5.2 is going to be the second section, and so on. But often you have paragraphs of text before the first section. And the question is, do you treat each individual paragraph as a sibling of the sections, or do you group those paragraphs into a sort of own section that just happens not to have a section number because it doesn't have, or a section heading, I should say. And the approach that we adopted with the Valaquenta was to basically treat it as a section. So if I were to draw this, I should have probably done a second slide, but just to kind of illustrate the point, what we would do is kind of group this in its own sorry if I do this while I live drawing of slides, but what we would basically do is treat this. I'll send it backwards again. It's still not liking it. Anyway, you probably get the idea. That we basically grouping those. Actually, what I'll do is just make it not filled. Would be the easiest way for you to see it. So in other words, we basically treat it as if these are grouped in a section 0, effectively, sort of thing. Okay, I think that's it for slides. We can get into the messy details now of Unfinished Tales. And the main thing that I'm going to sort of take notes on and everything is this document here, where I've already started to take some notes. So yeah, I don't know, Kiara, if there's anything you want to add before we get started into the messy details. If there's anything I missed from our Silmarillion work.
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Okay.
This is pretty much what we did in the principles that we applied, and we knew that possibly we would have to revisit all of it once we got to Unfinished Tales.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be nice if we didn't have to update the Lord of the Rings stuff, but the Silmarillion is definitely still in draft state.
That would certainly be nice.
Yeah. I just want to explain. So these are the notes that we took while we were going through the Silmarillion. And I just want to point out something that we found useful as an approach that we'll probably do here, which is sometimes we would pick particular structural sections of the text, and when we were trying to decide different approaches, list all the possible ways that thing could be referred to, and then discuss what was the most consistent one to choose. So, for example, one of the things we did was we took the trailer at the end of the Valaquenta. There's this separate thing at the end that just says, "Here ends the Valaquenta." And the question is, that doesn't really belong to the last section. It really belongs to the chapter as a whole, the thing as a whole, the Valaquenta as a whole. So is it yet another section? Does it have its own, how do we manage that? And we rattled off all the different sort of possibilities. At one stage, we weren't calling the Valaquenta VQ, we were calling it 02. And because the Valaquenta doesn't have chapters like the Quenta Silmarillion, we were putting it all into one chapter, and we threw both of those ideas out and ended up in the Silmarillion just going with the Valaquenta, starting with the VQ, and then the section number, one of the four sections of the Valaquenta. But we decided not to call this section 5, but to call it trailer. And similar decisions for the Valaquenta headings, the subheading of the Maya, and then things like how to deal with the Calibeth epilogue. So we're going to do very similar things for sections of Unfinished Tales. Okay, so I had started some notes, and I'd gotten maybe halfway through the text before I realized I needed this meeting to discuss this with you. But at a really high level, if you look at the table of contents of Unfinished Tales, it has, well, the contents, at least in the edition I've got in front of me, has an introduction and then a series of 4 parts. The actual text has a note and then an introduction and then the 4 parts. So we do need to at some point deal with the note. I'm not too worried about that sort of stuff for now. The main thing is getting the sort of core text done. We have this introduction and 4 parts. The parts are numbered: part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. So it makes sense for that to sort of be a top level system. And then each of these consists of a number of chapters. So there are 2 chapters in part 1. There are 4 chapters in part 2, 5 chapters in part 3, and 3 chapters in part 4. So we do naturally get this sort of 2.4 being the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. And I think that is pretty intuitive and straightforward, that 2.4 means part 2, chapter 4. There is a question about whether we use non-Arabic numerals for these sorts of things, like Roman numerals, for example. I'm reluctant to do that, even though that's what the table of contents does, because, well, we can debate that. I think the pros of using, well, the disadvantage of using like the Roman numerals is that they're really just a stylistic choice on the part of the formatting of a particular edition. There's no reason why one edition couldn't use Roman numerals and another one choose to represent it differently. And it's just, I think, easier for people to deal with. The counter argument is that if you are used to seeing the Roman numerals in the book, people may think of it in terms of the Roman numerals. But I'm going to put that question aside for now, because I think that question is largely orthogonal and independent to questions of how to structure it. Like once you've decided how to structure it, you can decide whether to use a Roman numeral or an Arabic numeral. But the decision of whether to use a Roman numeral or not doesn't impact how you otherwise structure it. And there are bigger issues to deal with. And so I think the challenges come up then within each chapter. I think we have a path forward to get to the chapter level. So as I said, 2.4 is the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. 1.2 is the children of Hurin, or the Nanihin Hurin. But so we could go through any of these at any time, but I want to start off talking about the first one that I discuss here, which is 1.2, the Nanihin Hurin. So the way that's structured, even before you look at the text, is that there are, just looking at the table of contents, there are named, they're headed sections, there are notes, and then there's appendix. That's the way that the table of contents lays it out. And I think that's pretty much mirrored. There's no top level paragraphs. It immediately goes into the first section, the children of Turin, sorry. Got to avoid my natural accent tendency to say Turin rather than Turin. So there's 13 headed sections, and then there's notes, and then there's an appendix. I think following, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chiara, but I think following the principles, and I say this here, I think the approach most consistent with what we landed on for the Silmarillion would be that we basically have 15 labels. So in other words, 1.2 would have 15 children, each of the 13 headed sections, then the notes, then the appendix. One of the alternatives is you group the 13 headed sections into their own child of 1.2. But I think that goes counter to the intuitiveness for the end user, because what that would mean is that you end up having some intermediate layer between the sections. So if I follow that principle of what do we call a particular what do we call a particular example? If we were referring to the first paragraph of the children, oops, don't want to type Greek. if we're talking about the first paragraph of the Children of Turin, what I'm suggesting is that would be something like 1.02.001, excuse me, rather than 1.2. Some intermediate thing that's used to distinguish the headed sections from the notes and the appendix. Does my question make sense? First of all, I guess for Damien and Andrew. Well, first of all, Kiara, because if Kiara doesn't understand it, then I'm really not doing a good job explaining it. Kiara, you get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
Damien and Andrew, is it clear what I'm talking about here?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I mean, I can sort of visually show it here. Is the structure of 1.02, headed sections, notes, appendix with section 1, section 2, section 3, or is it flatter like that? And it's the flatter approach I think we should go with, just because I don't think it's intuitive to have that extra layer for people.
No, I don't think you need that. I think the way you're doing it is simpler to find things.
Yeah. Just another thing. So what I've done in all the citation schemes is you zero padded the numbers to so they're always the same length.
Yeah.
One benefit of doing that is I think it also gives an additional cue as to whether we're talking about a chapter or a section or a paragraph or so on. Actually, I've got this wrong. I'm missing one. It should be that, right?
Right.
That was a trick. No one picked it up.
Yes, it's the first one.
Yeah, it's the first paragraph of the first section of the second chapter of the first part, right? I guess
James,
yep.
Just a question. How would you represent a note there? And would that be intuitive? That's my
okay.
Yeah.
You mean
that same example?
You mean one of the end notes in this chapter, or do you mean a footnote within this?
A footnote. Yeah.
There are no footnotes, so let's wait till we actually get to a footnote.
Okay.
If you've got a footnote in mind, we can discuss it. But right. I think they're all end notes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I was just wondering in general, like with the structure.
Yeah. We'll come to that.
Okay.
I want to kind of work top down. Part of the reason I'm hedging is because I don't have a definite answer, and we need to discuss it. But I think there's other things that would be useful to decide first.
So
they're in. Yep.
Go on, actually, I know that this is not the section that we're talking about, but in the battles of the forts of Isen, there are instances of these are not technically footnotes; they're like critical notes. I'm talking so for those of you who have the print edition.
Yep.
Like it's the first appendix of the battles.
The first appendix of the battles.
And
yeah.
Right. And it's pretty extensive.
Let's make a note of it, and let's make a note of it. We can jump to that. So let's just first of all start. So we know we're talking about part 3, right? It's in part 3. Is that right? Yes.
Yes.
Actually, I don't
Hold
need
on.
to.
It's actually it's part 5. It's part 3, number 5.
Well, I just realized I don't need the trailing zeros there because each of these chapters only has one. So it never gets. So we're talking about 3.5. So the structure of this is that it's basically got a series of top-level paragraphs, and then it's got notes, and then it's got an appendix. So let's first of all tackle how we refer to the individual paragraphs and how we refer to the notes in the appendix as a whole.
Yeah.
So let's assume we do something like notes. And I'll just abbreviate. We can come back to whether to spell out appendix or just put app. But so one question I have here. So unlike the children, unlike the Nanihin Hurun, there aren't numbered sections here. Labeled, headed sections here. It's just straight paragraphs followed by the notes in the appendix. So my first question is, do we jump straight to the paragraph numbering?
There's a 1 and a 2 in the appendices.
I know before we get to even before the appendix,
okay.
I'm just talking about the paragraphs in the main text.
Yeah.
I'll get to the appendix in a sec. I'm just saying, like the first paragraph of the whole chapter, the one that begins the chief obstacles to an easy conquest. Let me just type that out. The chief obstacles. What I'm questioning is, should that obstacles? Should that be 35001, or should we put in some intermediate structure?
So what we did for a Calabeth was we just went straight to the paragraph number.
Okay.
Because a Calabeth doesn't have, other recognizable sections in there.
I think, again, that makes sense just because of the intuitiveness for end users. If we had some intermediate structure, it means it's slightly different from the Nanihin Hurun, because the Nanihin Hurun does have. So in other words, the notes are at a different. The notes are in the Nanihin Hurun. The notes are parallel to the headed sections. In the battles of the Fords of Eisen, it's the siblings with the individual paragraphs, but I think that's fine. Okay, let's actually drill into your question, Chiara. So you made the point, Andrew, that the appendices have a higher level structure.
It has two parts to it.
There's two, and there's nothing outside those two parts, is there? No. So everything's either under 1 or 2. So we can immediately split that into 1 and 2. Whether it's interesting, this font. Oh, I'm in Greek again. I'm so used to typing in Greek that I just hit that key all the time.
You have brought up an interesting point, but it's unfortunate they've used it in this book. But the font's important as well.
Yes,
because the larger font is Tolkien and the lower and the smaller font is Christopher.
Yes.
Now that's a very weird way to do it, but they decided.
Except they switch it around in the chapter on
which
Galadriel.
Is even more confusing.
Yes. There's actually. So I was just going to say, one reason why I switched to using this edition.
Yeah, this is what I've got.
I was originally using the new illustrated one, but this makes a clearer distinction in the font size than that does. So I actually switched to it because it's bigger, because I'm getting to that age where I have trouble distinguishing. It's interesting you bring that up, Andrew, because in my History of Middle-earth, the digital version of History of Middle-earth that I'm working with, I actually ended up using different colors. I make Christopher's in blue and the main writing in black. And if HarperCollins ever asked me to typeset do a resetting of the History of Middle-earth, that's probably how I would do it. I would do a 2-color.
Well, that makes sense.
Like the illustrated,
it's easier to see the obvious difference, because particularly I'd forgotten about the fact that they swap it over halfway through, which is a very ridiculous thing to do. To be honest, it should be consistent. If you're going to do
exactly. So the what I started to play around with in the History of Middle-earth is actually I always any time that there's a interleaving of Christopher and John Ronald, I group them, and the ones that are Christopher actually have the letter C on them. So I number them. I have a situation where I do things like 1, 2C, 3, 4, 5C, that kind of thing. When I pointed this out to Eric Willahada, he said, well, what if the commentator's not Christopher? And I said, that's the beauty of using C. C could mean Christopher, but it could also mean commenter, commentary, whatever. So that's how I handled that. And we may find that that's useful to do here too.
Well, there's an issue, obviously. If you look at the notes, say, for the Battles of Fordovisor, some of the notes look like they're by Christopher, but then they say author's note, which basically means it's not Christopher, it's actually Tolkien. So how how to differentiate that, the author's note bit?
Well, sometimes they're a mix. So if you look at note 7,
yes, they're mixed.
So I don't know that at that point we can distinguish them with the referencing scheme, but certainly in my markup, my XML markup, I can make that distinction. Absolutely. Yeah. That's also relevant. So if you think of cases, I don't know that it happens in Unfinished Tales, certainly does in History of Middle-earth, where there's editorial correction, there's editorial injection sometimes even within the text. So just in square brackets or something, there'll be some note that Christopher makes about the state of the manuscript. And again, in the XML, I'm able to say, this is actually an emendation that either Tolkien made at a later, Ronald made at a later date, or Christopher is inserting. But that doesn't necessarily come into the referencing scheme. So coming back though to appendix. So again, I'm not sure whether to call this, dot. I'm going to give, I guess, different possibilities here, right?
I think you should, if you're not going to use Roman numerals, you shouldn't be using them here either. So that should be appendix.1 or appendix.2, not using Roman numerals.
Yeah. My only question is whether that will confuse. I think it's pretty obvious. If I told you go to 3.5.app.2.
Yes, well, it is 2. Yeah, it's 2 in Roman numerals. So.
Yeah. So, Chiara, did you have a specific concern about this? Because you'd suggested we look at it. Was it just this part, or was there a further? Oh, you're talking about the fact that it has footnotes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because we were discussing how to address endnotes.
Yes.
And we all mistakenly said that it doesn't have any footnotes, but it does.
Yeah, and interestingly, both of these footnotes on that page are to that appendix. Well, we get another question here. We could spend a bit of time on this appendix actually, because it will address a couple of issues. So if you just look at appendix 1, we've established that appendix 1, we're going to call this 3.5. We can revisit whether to call it app or appendix or whatever later. But it itself has an initial paragraph and then a quotation. And if I understand correctly, it's a little hard to follow the indentations across page breaks. But if I'm reading this correctly, the whole rest of the appendix is a quotation. Is that other people's reading?
Part 1 it is.
Yeah, I'm talking about part 1, yeah.
Part 1, yeah.
So in other words, it's an initial paragraph followed by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 paragraphs of quotation. So I guess my next question is that just 8? Do we do that as 8 paragraphs? Or do we try to group the quotation into its own.
I'm in favor of the flatter structure here.
Yeah, I think so too, for a couple of reasons. One is I still think it's intuitive, and it does remove some unnecessary structure. We can still in the markup say that 2 through 8 are a quotation, right? So in other words, what we're talking about is we're basically saying that 3.5.app.1.1 is that initial paragraph that ends with the colon. And then
so partly why I was thinking this is it really doesn't matter what type of text it is, because as long as you can count, you're on. There's no ambiguity. That's what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is sort of, again, that balance, right? Because logically you could argue the quotation is a single unit. But we can still refer to it. I mean, obviously we can still refer to it with a range. So there's no particular harm. I do want to bring up, you had mentioned in chat, Damien, the possibility of APPX as an abbreviation. So I just want to capture that idea. If people have other candidates for things, let me know, because I want to include them in this document. Even if we postpone deciding, I at least want to capture the candidates.
So the principle that we applied with Valaquenta eventually was that we would use sort of the full word. We did VQ head, VQ subtrailer.
Although we say VQ, not Valaquenta.
VQ, yes, we say VQ, but then every other sort of semantically, editorially relevant subsection. I think except for Akalabeth for the epilogue, where we used EP.
Yep.
Everything else we went with like the full word. I think eventually, since there are several sections in Tolkien's work that are named appendix, we're gonna need to find one definition that addresses all of those.
Yeah. I'm going to punt on that for now, though, just because it is a separate thing we can vote on later. But I think, is there any dissent on the idea that we do keep the 8 paragraphs of Appendix 1 flat?
I think that's the best way to do it. I agree with you.
Okay.
Okay,
perfect. Yeah. I mean, as Damien pointed out, we can, the XML can still represent that this is a quote, even though it's not addressable without a range. Okay, so now we can briefly talk about the footnote question. So one approach I've seen, I think this is similar to how Eric does it in LRC, is treat the footnote as a child of the paragraph that contains the text. So in other words, that star is off the second paragraph, right? It's referring to the east mark. So we would do to dot something.
Right. So I had a question about that because So, I think the problem we face here is the sequence. I would expect after paragraph, right, the next thing to be the word level or the sentence level or whatever.
Right.
And then putting a footnote there, we would have to decide where it's exactly inserted, because footnotes usually refer to a single either word or sentence, right?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. I think the fact that it's attached to a particular word or phrase, I don't think we can capture in the citation system itself. We want to capture that in the XML for sure. What the anchor is. This is just being able to reference the text of the footnote itself. So actually, I think I may have misspoken when I said that LRC treats it as a child. I think he may treat it as another sibling, which might get around your issue, Damien. Like, yes, I think actually he may call it 1-2 star without a dot in between, kind of thing. And 1-2 dagger for the second one. The only thing I don't like about that is that let me see how I don't even know how to get the dagger. There we go. The only thing I don't like about that is it makes what I view as a very physical formatting choice, bakes it into the referencing scheme, right? It's like our choice not to use Roman numerals, right? The fact that it uses an asterisk.
They could change those.
Yeah, exactly.
They could change them.
Yeah, exactly. It is a very, like, and in fact, it's the sort of thing that I can imagine Houghton Mifflin doing differently to HarperCollins or something. You know what I mean? It's one of those things where it's probably house style more.
Yeah, it's an editorial decision. And different editors could well say, well, I don't like that, I'll do a different one.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm reluctant to do that, although it solves the problem that Damien brought up, which I'm sensitive to.
Yeah, Footnote might do it, actually. As long as we know that. So what we could do is Footnote always comes at the highest level where it's applicable, right? So Footnote can go to the paragraph level.
Yep.
And anything after that, right? So if we need to actually point out to the exact location of a footnote, it can go, like we could move it potentially, right? To actually point that out at a certain.
Sure.
Yeah, you know, whenever, because it's actually a sibling. But if we made it a child, then that couldn't happen because it's there's no way to move up from a child. That's what I mean.
Right.
So I like the footnote thing. I think it should be spelled out probably, as Kyra was saying. But yeah.
So you're saying actually make it a child of the paragraph in the citation scheme? So have the dots.
It would look like a child, but it's actually
sure.
A sibling.
Yeah.
And then because we note footnotes apply as siblings, then we can potentially, when we want to specify exactly where it is, then we know footnotes can be moved downstream until the word level, you know?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we'll have that information in the XML if we need it. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
But okay, my next question is, do we, I guess between these two, whether we spell it out as footnote or not, but in other words, do we call it footnote 1 or footnote .1? In other words, do we have a node in the hierarchy that's all the footnotes for that paragraph? And then or do we just call them footnote 1? So that versus that.
I like the dot notation. I think it makes a clear distinction between, like, if there's more than one footnote, you don't have to have a dictionary of footnotes. You can just
right. Yeah, you're not doing you're not searching whether the label starts with the word footnote or FN.
Exactly. You kind of reduce the mapping by abstracting. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm not 100% convinced on the FN versus footnote, so I'm going to actually. Well, I think they're both candidates.
I mean, as a reader, I think footnote is a lot clearer than FN.
Yep.
And it's also more generalizable. Still the same logic as the appendix. It is likely that we will have the same problem elsewhere. And coming up with a structure that is semantically meaningful at this point, I think it's preferable than to have too many abbreviations. As of now.
I'm gonna quote Pip 8 and say Explicit is better than implicit.
Yeah. My only concern, I agree with that sentiment. My only concern, and I'm going to mark it as green for now. My only concern, and this comes back to the sort of intuitiveness, or not so much intuitiveness, but sometimes I think about barriers to people using this. Like what would make people look at this and go, I'm not going to use that. Like if somebody's giving a talk and they're quoting this footnote and they, you know, I can see people saying this is too long. Why can't I just write FN or an APP or something like that? So that's something in the back of my mind. I'm not saying it's a strong enough argument, but it does occur to me. I can hear people saying that's too long. I'm not going to use that.
What do you think, Andrew?
I was just looking at the ebook. I can't actually find in there these. Oh, they are addressed. Actually. I was just going to say how they've done them in there. And yeah, they just put them in as footnotes with stars next to them.
Yeah.
So that's probably not a good idea. I think having the numbers is a good idea because they don't actually use the same. Oh, they do use the same ones. They have. And they put them right at the end of the book as a footnote section.
Right. Yeah, they do.
Yeah. So yes, I think having them as numbers is probably better, and I think it's whatever people think is the best way to do it around the numbering.
Yep.
I'm not sure myself on that
one. I have not been checking the chat. Is anybody saying anything in the YouTube chat?
Not yet. I asked if
cool.
anybody has opinions about that.
Okay, cool.
So right. just to say something that may be obvious to everybody, but just for the people following.
Yep.
The reason why we are a little bit uncertain with this is that the footnotes of the appendix are footnotes for a reason, right? Because elsewhere, wherever it's not an appendix, like in the actual sections of Unfinished Tales, we have endnotes.
Yes.
Whereas these are footnotes because this is an appendix. There is a very specific editorial reason for that. And so I think it wouldn't make any sense to change that structure in our citation system by treating them as endnotes, which I don't think is a matter of discussion. Mm-hmm. Whereas it could make sense to use numbers as opposed to symbols for the reasons that we were mentioning before, that these are sort of editorial choices and it's not guaranteed that they will be fixed and stable, not even in the future, in future editions.
I mean, to be honest, as you were speaking, I'm thinking, could we just treat them as endnotes? But I think that would be non-intuitive for readers. And
we're also trying to encode things as they are.
Yes.
Right. With the flat structure. So we cannot and we should not make editorial decisions on our own.
Yes. This is again that struggle between the consistent logical and the intuitive for end users, because there's part of me that's kind of like, if we're really abstracting away from the editorial decisions, then we should just treat them as endnotes. And the fact that they're footnotes is just an editorial thing. But I agree that gets too far away from what users will expect and find helpful. Well, let's quickly do the notes. I think the notes are straightforward, right? They're probably just something like 3.5.notes.3 or 4. I typed 4. I said 3.
Should it be note?
It's headed notes.
Yes, they're all
right. It's headed notes. Yeah.
I'm going to just again make a note of the fact that is a decision we have to make. Although I'm leaning towards it being plural just because that's what it's headed.
So I have Sarah Jameson here.
Yes. Hi, hey, Sarah.
Your student. She's asking if, they say footnotes and appendix to make it easier for the reader. That's their vote.
Okay, excellent. That's good enough for me.
Yeah, it can get long to cite, but writing it out should take second place to the intuitiveness in following which section is which. So I had a thought. I don't know what others think about this in the live stream, but we could have potentially a shorter and a longer version and use the shorter version for things like internal use or whatever. And then like a longer version that would just convert automatically for things like blog posts or, things like more external communication.
Yeah. I mean, a good example of that is in Search Tolkien, I started doing this. So for example, if I search for Morgoth, notice that it says it spells out Appendix A, even though the code is just A. Or in the Silmarillion, it spells out Valaquenta section 4, even though it's VQ.04. So there's definitely a distinction between what we actually use as a citation system and what we present to a user in things like the search results, for sure. But if we're still talking about what we use actually as the citation form, I'm still inclined to do the expanded version.
Well, I think for one letter, it's where it's a long. It's like appendix. It's different, isn't it? It's where it gets longer and longer. Notes and notes doesn't really make any difference.
Well, and
longer,
I'm thinking
longer
more
ones do.
Yeah. I'm thinking more the footnote and appendix. But I mean, I'm happy to lean towards the fully spelling it out. Sarah made good points. Chiara, you also, as you said, it avoids us having to catalog abbreviations.
Yeah.
Right? Because what if something else comes along later that happens to start with APP, and we've already used APP for appendix, then we have to decide, right. And then it's if we actually explicitly spell it out.
Going back to notes, obviously there's an introduction to most of the notes. How do you reference that?
I'm glad you brought that up. Is there an introduction in 3.5 explicitly? There isn't in 3.5. If you've got an example where the notes do have
in the Narnahirian, this one, there's an introduction.
So let's go back
to the notes.
Yeah. So let's go to that. So we've already established that the Narnahirian is 1.2. Or 0.2. I'm still vacillating on whether. I think 1.2. I'm just, the reason I'm vacillating on 1.2 versus 1.02 was I was just reminded, Chiara, for the Valaquenta, we used as leading 0 on the sections, even though there were only 4 of them, because we wanted to be clear it was a section, not a chapter.
I was gonna say that, and we also did. So the guiding principle was the citation system of Lord of the Rings, where things are fairly intuitive.
Yeah.
And so since it's just another 0 and it fulfills a sort of semantic function, we decided to keep it even for sections that don't necessarily have 2 digits.
So really then, because these are chapters, if we were consistent with that decision, these should all have leading 0s.
Yes.
Okay, let me just add that in because there's no reason to break that rule.
I don't think you needed leading 0 before right at the beginning. You definitely don't need that.
Yes.
No, for the parts, definitely not. Yeah, and I just think it's a good visual indication of it kind of reinforces the hierarchy, right? That you've got parts which are there are a few of them and they're big, and then you've got the chapters. Yeah, that's consistent with.
Yeah.
Correct.
Because I think if I recall correctly, if I just let me pick Gandalf because he's in all all three. But if you look here, actually, I have to fully expand it. Like in the Hobbit, it's there's always a 0 leading on the chapter.
Well, that's because there's more than 10. Yeah, that's one.
But we do the same thing then in Lord of the Rings. Yeah. There's a mistake here. I'm going to change it. I want the book number shouldn't have a leading 0. I'm going to change that. But the chapter, I like the fact that chapters always have leading 0s. There's a consistency across all the citations then.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And it makes the hierarchy very clear.
Yeah.
Chapters have 2 digits, sections have 3 digits.
No, sections still only have 2. Paragraphs have 3.
Paragraphs, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Even if there are fewer than 100 paragraphs in that chapter,
sure.
we still do 3. Yeah. Yeah. I should note that in the principles, actually. That's something that would be worth explicitly noting. Okay, but back to Andrew's point about the initial content of the notes. I think the way that we would do that, if I'm not mistaken, Kiara, with the way we would have done that in Silmarillion is call it 0. It's this issue, basically. You've got this top level. So you treat this as a section 0. I don't think there's any other way of doing it, right?
Well, unless you don't put anything there at all, it's just notes, and then that's it.
Well, no, you can't do that because of the principle that says that 102 notes refers to the notes as a whole.
Right.
So it has to be dot something.
Right.
Oh, okay. Right.
And 0 is as good a something as anything else, I think. I mean, you could give it a name, but the problem is, where does that name come from?
Do they have any at the end of the notes?
That's a very, very, very good point, because that does come up. I'm almost 100% sure if it doesn't come up in, it might be 002, because there's more than 10 notes.
That wouldn't work then, would it? Because if you put that a number at it, it's going to be that people will think it was a next note, and there isn't a next note.
Yeah, and I'm not. Yeah, that's a very good point. And this is something we've faced we faced it with a Calibeth, right, Kiara?
Yep.
So we faced it with a Calibeth in Silmarillion. It's slightly different than an extra paragraph at the end of the notes, in that it was clearly an epilogue, and so we labeled as an epilogue. In fact, I can scroll up and show it. Yeah, we discussed that very point, and we ended up calling it EP, AKEP, because you get exactly the situation you mentioned, Andrew, which is there are 82 paragraphs in the Calibeth, and then there's this separate thing. And calling it 83, it's a separate thing with its own 4 paragraphs. Yeah. And calling it, so the 3 choices we had was the third choice was we just make it completely flat. So we have 86 paragraphs. The second choice was we have 2 groups. We have the first 83 paragraphs in section 1, and then 3 paragraphs in section 2. But then there's that's confusing, because no one expects the first paragraph. No one can see that there's a section 01. That's a made up section we did. And so what we ended up landing on is saying the main paragraphs are just numbered from the top, and then the epilogue paragraphs are grouped under EP, although maybe we should expand that to epilogue.
It looks like in this book there aren't any at the end, but there's an interesting point, though, for Alderaan and Erendis, where they actually have a name for the first bit of the notes.
Yes, I think
they call it chronology.
Yes, I bring that up. We should probably come back to because I brought up some of these points in my earlier thing. So let's actually go through my notes already and see what we come up with based on the decisions we've already made. So in Of Tuor and His Coming to Gondolin just has paragraphs, no headed sections. Then so that's easy. So I had a question about how to do 1-1 in light of how we're doing 1-2. And the outstanding question seems to be this. So let me I'm going to copy that down and we can discuss it and then continue to the next one. Just make this back. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay. I think the mixing levels is fine. So what I'm talking about here is the fact that basically we'll end up with paragraphs that are at the top level are like that, but the paragraph, but notes are that. And originally I was saying this mixes levels, but I think that's fine, especially if paragraphs are always 3 digits.
Yeah, the serial padding does it, I think.
Yeah.
It might not be super intuitive at first for the user. So, I mean, that's something.
Well, I think it's clear though. If you say 1.01005, say that means the 5th paragraph of 1.1, and that means not that there are 5 paragraphs in note 3, but
sure.
But that means, note 3, the 5th paragraph of note 3 of chapter 1 of part 1. I think that's, it does mean, but I think this is what's unavoidable. It does mean that if I do any kind of expansion of what this means, like in the search results, like I do here, where I say book 1, chapter 1, it does mean that has to be sensitive to what happens early. I can't tell what to label something just by how far in the dotted notation it is. I need to know like what's gone before. Like the fact that the 3rd level says notes tells me that the 5th level is paragraph. Whereas here the paragraph is at the 3rd level. But I think that's fine. I don't think I'm fine with that. So this all seems, any objection to that stuff?
No, that seems fine.
I'm just going to call it. Okay. So the next thing that I had brought up in my notes was, I don't think 2.1 had any issues. So maybe this is exactly what you brought up then, Andrew. So let me just read through this. So 2.2 starts off with normal paragraphs that are not headed. There's indented quotations, but they're part of the main text, not editorial. That's all fine. When we get to the further, okay. So even before we get to the notes that you mentioned, there's some issues. So let's address the further course of the narrative question first. Bring it up in the book. This is a bit of a tricky one. Oh, look what I have here. I have an uncut. I'm just going to show for the collectors watching. Yeah, I've got an uncut page there. What would you do, Trotter? What would you do? Would you cut that or would you leave it?
I'll cut it so I can read the page.
I don't believe you.
The books that are originally were not cut and you had to cut them yourselves, I don't cut. I'll
right,
leave
because
those.
It's valuable, yeah.
Because I've got some of those that people never cut them. But if they're meant to be cut in the first place, yep. Cut them.
For those of you who aren't familiar, Trotter is a a collector of note to such an extent, and I'll say this on the live stream because I want to make this a thing. Possession of over 100 possession of 100 copies of the same book is called a trotter, and so I own a half trotter of Silmarillions. How many copies of The Hobbit do you have, Andrew?
125.
There you go. That's why. That's why it's called a trotter if you own 100. Okay. Where was it? I was trying to get to the headed section in Aldarion and Arendus. There we go. So what to do with this is the question. Before we even get to the notes, there's the further course of the narrative, which all seems it's all Christopher, actually. This was not 100% clear to me in my other edition, but it's much clearer in this this edition.
Yeah, because the font's a smaller size.
Yeah.
I wonder why I didn't put that in the notes, but anyway, let's not go into this.
Or in a pen, yeah. But we do need to solve this. How do we address... For example, the from the point where.
Well, it's a bit like the sections in the original chapter, because you've got it starts off as a mariner's wife, and then it goes into the very first bit, and then it goes into this. The first section is called the mariner's wife.
Is it, or is that okay? This is you're bringing up an interesting question that we faced with the Valaquenta. This is actually the bit that needs to be cut. The Mariner's Wife is a subtitle for the whole chapter, I would argue. It's not
But not for that bit.
Title of the section.
But it's not for the further course of the narrative, though, is it?
I don't know. I mean, it's
I don't think it is.
It's presented as if it is, though.
They're not included in the summary of the contents, though. So the Mariner's Wife is included in such a way that it appears like a subtitle. The further course of the narrative is not included in the contents anywhere.
Yeah, I was going to say that the table of contents makes it clear the Mariner's Wife is an alternative title.
Yes.
For Eldarion and Arendus, not a subsection, I would argue.
Exactly, and it's the same with the history of Galadriel and Celeborn.
No, okay, I agree with that then. Yes, that makes sense.
That's why the table of contents is helpful sometimes, because it can sometimes reveal more structure than the typesetting itself of the actual chapter itself does. But okay, this is tricky because this may be one of those cases where we don't invent a virtual section, because I think that would be a mistake to do so. In this case, right? So one option we have is that all of the paragraphs prior to the further course of the narrative, we put in this numbered section 1 that otherwise doesn't. So let me give a concrete example. The first paragraph of the main narrative. I'm going to have to cut. I don't have a knife handy, and I don't really want. Well, it's already starting to tear.
Yeah, you do need to use a knife for that. Don't tear it.
Exactly. Yeah, I know. Can somebody tell me or type in here what the first few words of the chapter are? Maybe I'll get another edition. Where my cursor is, Kiara, can you type?
I can only make suggestions in there.
Oh,
but
really?
I can do that.
Oh,
yeah. For some reason.
I can change that. I trust you. There you go. You're in edit. I've got to save. Sorry. Now you're in editor.
Okay. Okay, so for the course of the narrative and then the chronology, I was actually looking at another thing yet, but I can do that.
But what's the first few words of the chapter as a whole?
Okay, let me just check that. Oh, there we go.
In other words, what's the first few words of 202001?
Okay, so here. Oops.
Oh no, you're still in suggestion mode.
Let me just refresh.
Yep.
Okay, should be good to go.
Yeah, type where my cursor is.
Okay. Okay, so we got. Okay, good. I get that. So 2.2.
No, above, just right above, just as I
above?
did for the chief obstacles, where I quote
cool.
it and then I put underneath the alternative.
So just underneath the mariner's wife.
Yes. What's the first few words of the yeah? Actually, you know what? I should know this because I think it's what I've got in the thumbnail for this video. Was the XML for this chapter? Right. So I should have actually known that. Anyway,
put it in the chat.
The point is. It's there. The point is that
oh, sorry.
It's okay. I took way too long than I needed to. The question is whether we invent this artificial section. I'm really strongly against adding this artificial section. Just again, this is one of those making it intuitive for readers rather than for you end users rather than logical. So I'm strongly leaning towards this as the option.
I agree.
But that then raises the question, what's the from the point where paragraph called? It has to be something .1, right? And the question is, what is that?
So this is an editorial addition.
Yep.
To the sort of original section that this was intended to be.
Yeah, this is a very, very History of Middle Earth kind of thing to do. Like the History of Middle Earth just does this everywhere, which is, bit of text that Ronald wrote, followed by commentary by Christopher.
It's like a little interpolation or integration.
Or, my father continued this on a book that, with this, it was handwritten and such and such. And here's a summary of what his notes in the margin say. And
he does the same in History of Galadriel and Celeborn. Or does he not? Yes, he does. Okay.
There's going to be even more of this in that chapter, I believe.
Yeah. Because it seems to be, judging from what I'm looking at, seems to be the same thing. And in the History of Galadriel and Celeborn, these are definitely like organized sections.
So again,
there's more than one.
Yeah, the way that I did this, actually, it's funny that I was so adamant that to go with option 1 rather than option 2 here, because this actually goes against what I ended up doing in History of Middle Earth, because the History of Middle Earth does so much alternating between father and son without any intervening headings. I always put a virtual, I'm going to call them virtual sections. I always put a virtual section in around them because I thought it was important to be able to address father and son. So this is a tough one. This is a really tough one. I think we'll see what we end up deciding when we get to the Galadriel chapter.
Well, there's also the notes that come later on, obviously are numbered, but the numbers refer to both sections. If you have it into 2 sections, then of this, then the notes have weird numbering at that point.
Well, they'll still just be 0. I think it'll be fine because I think they'll just be 202 notes, right?
That's not what I meant. But what I meant is that the notes the numbers for the notes refer to the earlier section, and if you split that section into two, it makes a difference on where on the notes on how you list the notes, because they carry on in number order. They don't change.
They do carry on in number order.
I
still don't know if that changes what we would. Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
I still think it's just going to end up being 202 notes and then the note number. And then, as you mentioned before, Andrew, there's also the initial.
Yeah, that's a chronology as well.
Yeah, there's an initial paragraphs. We'll come back to that. So we have two outstanding questions. Basically, what to put in the XXX, I think. The two XXXs. So what to call this commentary?
So
you can't call that one
towards...
0, could you? Because it's not. That would have to have a name.
You could, but I would not. I would not call it 0.
Zero.
There's nothing technically to prevent it, but I would not. I'm going to propose. This is just a straw proposal, but I mean,
yeah,
we could call it commentary, even though it's not.
It is commentary, though. It is, to be honest. Yeah.
So this is just one commentary section in Alarion and Derendis, right?
No. I'm not calling it commentary 0-1.
Okay.
If there was more than one headed commentary, then we might do something like that.
Right, because there's the Galadriel and Celeborn.
Yeah. We can revisit this once we've done Galadriel and Celeborn. It may be that what I'm proposing here doesn't make sense or is inconsistent with the solution we come up with for Galadriel and Celeborn. But this is the one I'm leaning towards for now. Subject to change.
I like that. I like that one.
Any objections, Damien or Kiara?
I think it works.
We can revisit. I mean, all of these are subject to change once we get through Galadriel and Celeborn.
One of the principles that we discussed when we had the conversation about the Silmarillion was that we probably have to give up on the idea that this can be a uniformly hierarchical system.
Yes.
Because sometimes there is just no hierarchy.
Yeah.
And we have to encode that because we cannot make our own editorial decisions.
Yeah, that's already true. That was the point I was making up here with the paragraph being on the 5th level if it's under a note, but under the 3rd level if it's not. Yeah. Is that what you mean by give up on the hierarchy? You mean that you can't assume from how many dots there are what the type of the thing is. You need to look at you need to have some knowledge of the... Yeah,
we can give clues as to what is what, but we cannot address the issue of where is what.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right. And the main clue for that, sorry to interject, but the main clue for that is once you have the addition information there, then the user is going to be able to find the book and then open it in the correct point. So it doesn't need to be specific for everything. Just know which edition you need. One thing that I think it would be worth for viewers is of this live stream later on is to know that these conventions usually work well in paper, and then you have to test them in the field. So that's why these things might change later on, and that's of course going to be documented elsewhere in the website.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, definitely. One other thing I'll bring up, this is only relevant to a subset of people here, but I've been thinking about having a machine actionable description of these citation schemes, like a JSON file that tells you that if the third thing is a commentary, that the second thing is a section, or if the third thing says notes, then the 5th thing is a paragraph. Basically, I want to avoid, as I've shown here, the fact that I call this a chapter and that I call this a book, or I call this an appendix, or that I call this of the Rings of Power, or let me do another one. or the fact that I call this a section, it is currently hard-coded into Search Tolkien, but there's no reason why it should be Search Tolkien specific. I should have a JSON file or something that basically says, when you get something starting with an S, it follows this schema. When the S then has a VQ, it follows this subschema. Just something that lays out very clearly what the components mean. And then I can change Search Tolkien to use that JSON file to format this rather than hard code it. Anyway, little side point.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to suggest that for many reasons, but I can work on that in the future.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, the chronology one would just be 0, wouldn't it? Really?
Yes, we could call that 0. We could call that 0 for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, we could call that. It is a section because there's 2 paragraphs. So, and there's a heading. So if we call it 0 or 00, because it's a section, so I think that's what we would do. So the word chronology, I can actually spell this out more explicitly. The word chronology, I wonder what it wanted me to type there. That's interesting. Would be 0, something like that. And then the first paragraph, which starts Anardil, would be 0 to notes 00001.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that looks right.
The only other possibility is if 0 makes sense. I was gonna come up with another word for it, but again, that's making up a word that doesn't appear in the text.
The issue is, as we mentioned earlier, is and I can't find these. But if you put a note, something at the end that's not a note, how do you address that?
Yeah, we're gonna
that will come up at some point. That's got to be in here somewhere.
It definitely comes up in History of Middle Earth. Definitely. The other thing, sorry, I want to throw out all possibilities here, because even if we immediately reject it, I want to have documentation that it was thought of and rejected. The other possibility is to actually call it chronology.
Which we will immediately reject. I would immediately reject that.
Okay, we're going to go with this. But I wanted to capture that approach, which is if you've got it's a headed section. So much like we called the Valaquenta VQ, we did actually use the content of the heading in the label. But you're more than welcome to reject it, Kiara. And I'm going to go with that rejection for now. But I wanted, again, to document it because I didn't want to get a situation where we're like, oh, didn't we consider da, 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 da? Yeah, it's clear now. Okay. Was there anything else that I'd brought up in, or anyone else had brought up in Eldarion and Arendis? Okay, I think Okay, there's a small thing. We will get to the history of Galadriel and Celeborn soon, but there was a small thing in 2.3 I wanted to bring up, which is the Tar Miriel entry. So let's discuss that next. The Tar Miriel entry. I think it's because it's not numbered and the others are, and I don't know whether to just give it the next number. So this maybe actually touches on your issue, Andrew. So the line of Elros, the structure of that is it's got a subhead, it's got a heading and a subheading. It's got a single paragraph with an endnote, and then it's got these numbered entries, one for each king. They're all single paragraphs except for Palantir. So they do need to wrap a paragraph. They're not. And then there's 2 paragraphs of of Citation, which are not numbered. So I'm just going to, let me just type out the individual questions. So there's the question of what the realm, the initial paragraph is, the realm of Numenor. There's how we want to do, say, again, an example. The second paragraph of the Tar Palantir would be a good one. She married late. And then we have the Tar Miriel entry. She was born. Oh, we also have the actual title. So, like, what would the titles of these things be? So, what will the XXIV Tar Palantir? Oops, I mistyped that, but I'll fix it in a second. Oh no, I got it right. Okay.
Can I add another level of complexity?
Yep.
So the Tar Miriel entry is not exactly an entry because the following paragraph is still about Al-Farazon.
Oh, is it?
That's why it's not numbered.
Oh, I missed that. Sorry, I've already closed.
Oh, there looks like there's a mistake in there, doesn't there?
I don't know if it's a mistake or...
Because it says usurping the scepter of.
Right.
And then there's nothing after that. Then there should be something after that.
Isn't it Tar Miriel?
Is it? Yeah.
Well, that's on a separate line.
I know, but is it? Yeah. But is that who? Yeah. I mean, that is who the scepter was usurped from.
If it's a mistake, it shouldn't be on a separate line. It should be immediately after, in which case it's not a separate entry.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree that it's all one section and they've just styled it maybe incorrectly.
I think they've made a mistake there. I think that's an editorial mistake. But that's actually something interesting. I have to look at that. I think that should come up as something to have a look at.
Yeah,
but I think that is.
It should be at least indented. Like if Tar Miriel and the She Was Born was indented, I don't mind that it's on a new line. But the problem is, why is there a blank line and no blank line after died in the downfall?
I think there's definitely something wrong there.
Yeah, I would agree.
Or how it's set out.
Yeah.
So in this case, I don't think it's a huge problem. But you're right. If that is a separate section for her, because basically it's the kings and queens, isn't it? But she's not a queen because
she never,
previous king, she never became a
queen.
So why? So yeah.
Okay, let's work through these. We'll get to that in a sec.
Yeah.
So we're talking about 2-3, right? So these all start 2-0-3. We know that much. What should that? Is this first paragraph just a zero? Is it 00001? Is there actually any other possibility?
No, it's 0, isn't it? The first paragraph's going to be zeros.
Yeah, it's sort of in its own. Because what I'm thinking is that in other words, the Elros entry will be
1.
Will be 1. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to use numbers rather than Roman numerals. No one minds. Although.
Well, that becomes complicated then if you. These ones probably should be Roman numerals.
Yeah, I'm actually okay with these ones being Roman numerals.
Yeah,
because
they should be Roman numerals.
They feel like they're not just an editorial decision. It feels like that's actually content. But I'm willing to discuss that. Chiara's thinking.
Yeah, I sort of have like a reader point of view issue with the 00 after 03. I know what it's intended to represent, but I'm wondering if it's necessary?
Well, it would not be necessary if we use Roman numerals.
Right.
If we use Roman numerals for the entries, then you could just call this 001.
Yeah.
I'm actually okay with that, using Roman numerals. And if we use Roman...
The reason why I think it should be Roman numerals is because kings are often, and queens are often described with Roman numerals.
Yeah, it definitely feels part of the content.
And, English kings and queens obviously are Roman numerals. So
yeah,
I understand why Tolkien would use that. And it makes sense. Well, it doesn't make sense necessarily for chapter numbers of a book, but I think it does in this case.
Right. Yeah, I'm fairly persuaded by that.
And it would give us a little bit more room to discuss how we want to encode what is effectively a subtitle from the founding of the city.
Well,
or a subhead.
Yeah.
It's a subhead.
Yeah. I mean, that's we should. Well, do we? Yeah, we should probably decide that.
I think that's the same thing as what we did with Valaquenta. Well, not exactly, but sort of.
What would we have called it there?
Subhead.
Just that?
Yeah. We had head for, I think, specifically where Valaquenta appears. Was it that? And then subhead for account of the Valar and Maiar according to blah, blah.
Yeah.
That's what it is to me.
Yeah, just to remind everyone, these were all the things we discussed for the subheading. Right. We discussed like grouping the two headings under a head and calling that .2, calling it 00, but then with a .b. They're also 00 with a 02. But what we landed on was 02 subhead. People can object to that if they want, but it will require a review of the Silmarillion stuff too.
I think it's fine.
So if we go with this, that I think that's quite good, and then we go with that. Okay, so that then makes Tar Palantir married late. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and then now we come to the Tamiriel entry. So do we treat... So one possibility is we treat those two lines, the Tamiriel and the She Was Born, as paragraphs within that entry.
I would favor that approach just because of this particular edition, and that can change between editions, no?
So I mean, it would be
you'll
that
have to have mappings later, but sure.
And that would be, and then the of the deeds would be that.
Yes, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's probably the safest, most conservative.
Yeah, we'll go with that. And if it turns out, if we can get to the bottom of what this is supposed to say, we can change it. I mean, this chapter, I have a whole blog post. I'll just point out to people that might be interested on Digital Tolkien. There's a.
Could you paste it in the chat so I can put it on YouTube?
Yeah, sure. This was a fun blog post to write. So this blog post is about the inconsistencies in the king lists between Lord of the Rings and the letters, and like I go through all of the. Basically, Christopher made a mistake in you can read the blog post because it's complicated. Yeah.
Do you mention? Do you remember? Do you mention this extra line being in here or in that blog post?
Oh, that's a good. No, I don't think I do because it's purely getting to the bottom of why this all started, because the first to second edition of the Silmarillion changes two of the king's numbers. Actually, a subsequent impression of the second edition changed a third number as well, but it was all to do with the fact that Christopher had interpreted the Lord of the Rings appendices one way, and then he discovered the document that was used for the Line of Elros chapter that we're looking at now, and that actually revealed that he'd misinterpreted the Lord of the Rings appendix. The Lord of the Rings appendix has a mistake, basically. And Christopher went the wrong direction in correcting the mistake until he found this Line of Elros passage and realized that the mistake needed to be corrected a different way, which led to corrections to the Silmarillion and Robert Foster's book and
Lord of the Rings.
Tyler's book and corrected Lord of the Rings. Right. Anyway, it's a fun little story that I tried to summarize here.
It's interesting.
That all came out because of the textual history of the Silmarillion editions work. Okay. I think we've got a good tentative proposal for that, the Line of Elros. Let's come up. We should probably try to stop at the 2-hour mark, even if there is more things to discuss afterwards. I think we'll have enough to kind of write up a proposal. So let's finish up with the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, because I suspect if we can solve this, then we're in pretty good shape. So let's remind ourselves of the issues here. So we're talking about 3.04, right? So I'm actually confused. It does seem like this still uses the smaller font for Christopher.
Yes, it does.
Even though he says in the introduction that he switched, I thought.
Well, certainly the first paragraph's in a small font, and that's Christopher writing that. That's Christopher's commentary. That's not Tolkien's.
Yeah, all the way through to the notes.
Because he wouldn't have said Tolkien wouldn't have said
that. Well, he may have admitted it. I don't know.
I don't know.
May
Probably
not have
not. No.
Okay, so let's kind of take a look through this. Let's look at it top down. So even before we get to the question of how to represent Christopher versus Ronald, okay, just paging through this, there's one thing I noticed that I do want to point out. So I can't give you page numbers. That's the whole point of this referencing scheme. If you're on the same edition as me, it's page 225. But the heading concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, I would argue, is not a heading in this chapter. It's a heading in if I read it correctly, it's a heading in the manuscript that Christopher is quoting.
Yes, it is.
Which makes a difference, in my opinion.
It's referencing a text that Tolkien wrote.
Like Tolkien had a manuscript that was headed concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, and that's being. I think that makes a slight difference, potentially, to the way we handle it. It's not a separate section; it's a quote that happens to have a heading. If that makes sense, which is in contrast. Well, and actually, no, I take that back because the text is small. I take that back. The text is small afterwards, so it's not part of talk. No. Ignore what I said. It is a section that Christopher heading that Christopher gave. Okay, so we have a bunch of paragraphs, some of which are Christopher, some of which are Ronald. They continue through until we get that heading. That does seem to be a heading of a section of Christopher's commentary. He uses the 3 stars. This is actually very, very helpful. Let me explain why those 3 stars. Well, maybe they're not in every edition, but in my edition, Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn has 3 paragraphs and then 3 stars, right?
Yeah.
The reason that's very handy is what that tells you is the Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn section ends there. There's no other way. This is an issue with headings. Headings don't tell you where the section ends. They only tell you where the section starts. And if you have a situation where you have a section embedded within something and what follows that section is just a paragraph rather than a new section, then it's ambiguous where the section ends. And that's what these 3 stars are indicating. So what we have is a bunch of paragraphs combining Christopher and Ronald. We have these 3 paragraphs that are headed Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, and then that section ends, and then we get some more naked paragraphs without a heading.
Unfortunately, you don't. If you go to page 231 and look at the bottom, it says here the text concerning Galadriel and Celeborn comes to an end.
Very good catch.
So that is probably the start of it, and then that minus is the end.
That's a good point.
That's an introduction to it. The first
bit
before
you're
the
right,
start is the introduction.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. So, I mean, my point still stands at that line on 231
indicates something.
Yeah.
It indicates something.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then there's it's almost this epilogue. And then there's the Amroth and Nimrodel, which does the same thing. It's a headed thing, but now we've actually got some actual quotes. And then we've got the Elisar. And then that's the end. So it seems to me, okay, this is starting to become a little clearer. I'm just going to take some notes here. We've got a bunch of paragraphs of both types, commentary and quotation. Then we've got Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn. Then we've got Amroth and Nimrodel. And are we actually agreed now that there's actually nothing in between?
There is something in between, though, isn't there?
Well, there's structure under Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn.
Yeah, there's another paragraph. There's one paragraph between.
But isn't that still part of Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn?
Maybe not.
Because he's put the line. He's split it some other, hasn't he?
So
let me sketch this out, and we could come back. Hang on a second. Let me put the LSR.
Yeah.
This is the main part. Oops. And then.
Yeah, and then there's notes after that.
And then there's notes. Oh, I want to dedent this. Why is it not letting me dedent it? Do I do that?
And appendices.
It's not letting me do an outline the way I want. Oh, well. I'm not going to use indentation then. So we've got the main part, and then we've got notes and the appendices, but let's just worry about the main part for now.
The notes and the appendices look very similar to what we've already talked about. So I don't
there may not be any issues there.
Yeah.
Okay. What are people thinking about the...
Well, the Amroth and Nimrodel and the LSR appear to be sections that are pretty obvious where the sections are. Whereas Galadriel and Celeborn, there's this final paragraph, which I don't know.
You talk about the one that says it may be noted?
Yeah, it is to do with them, though, isn't it, really? I suppose it is part of that. It is part of that section, isn't it, really?
I think it is.
Yeah, and it makes it simpler if you do that. If you leave it as part of that section, it's
Gary, you seem to be not so sure.
So the whole concerning Galadriel and Celeborn is commentary, right? It doesn't contain, or does it? It doesn't contain any direct quotes from
Tolkien.
Tolkien himself. Is that right? Does it?
No, it does. It does have Tolkien's text.
Does it?
In it? Yeah, it does. Yes.
The bit between the stars and the line
is Tolkien's text.
Oh, okay. So the structure is still the same as the other two. Okay.
There is a little bit of interjection in square brackets, but that doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and also the very final sentence that says here the text concerning Galadriel Celeborn comes to an end. Christopher's got to have written that. He probably wouldn't have written that. So there is a bit of editorial stuff in there as well.
You could be right, but it's possible that Tolkien, if he was viewing this as a found manuscript,
could he write that himself?
Well, let's get the here ends the Valaquenta.
Yeah, he wrote that.
It's odd. I agree. It's odd that he says the text comes to an end. Like it doesn't say here concerning Galadriel. I don't know. I'm playing devil's advocate, partly, but yeah. I don't think it affects the addressing, but sorry.
It doesn't affect the addressing at all.
So no, that section, I mean, I'm sort of philologically confused at, when I find a text that says, okay, this section comes to an end, and then there is another paragraph, which in turn actually functions as an introduction to the next section.
Yeah. And there's a big line break in the middle as well in my copy. So there's clearly a big section.
So you think, so, okay, you're not wanting then to put that?
I mean, I would be fine either way. It's just that it's not entirely intuitive to me because there are editorial cues that signal that the part concerning Galadriel and Celeborn ends where we have comes to an end. And then there is that little paragraph afterwards, which ends with, as will be shown below, which functions as sort of an intro to Amroth and Imrodel.
The next section.
So it almost functions as a transition between the two.
Yep.
Which also means that, again, I would be fine either way because there is probably no definitive way of encoding that. It's just a matter of deciding whether we want it to be part of the first or the second.
Yep. Let me ask, just because this is another topic that doesn't hinge on the answer to that necessarily. Within Amroth and Nimrodel, whatever we come up with as the identifier for the Amroth and Nimrodel section, do we immediately go to paragraphs or do we have intermediate divisions that capture the alternation between commentary and text?
I think it's paragraphs again because it's how we've done the earlier ones. I think it's the same.
It is, but this is where it differs from the way I did it, the way I've started History of Middle Earth. If I adopted the History of Middle Earth approach to the Amroth and Nimrodel, I would say, let me count them, that there's a Christopher section followed by I'll call them C section and J section, a C section, a J section, a C section, a J section, a C section, a J section, and so on, each of which may contain more than one paragraph, rather than a flat list of paragraphs. And one reason I like that is because it means, so in other words, what I would do is I would call it like 1C and 2. So 1C would be that I have. 2 would be that Amroth was. I'm just putting this as a and then obviously, sorry, they would each be 001 and so on, right? It'd be within that. So you can.
So what's the argument against treating those Christopher Tolkien sections differently than, say, footnotes at a paragraph level?
Well, the argument for what I'm doing right now is that I think it's much easier to find the third, the section in the smaller typeface than the
right. But that's
paragraph.
Depending on the edition, right? So if the edition changes, then
Thank you.
The citation system doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, I don't know how likely that is, given that this is. I mean, I agree that how it's styled might vary from edition to edition, but the fact that the foregoing narrative is a Christopher section is not going to change.
Yeah, that's correct. It isn't. They are differentiated. They have differentiated them.
Yeah. However, they get differentiated in one edition versus another. I agree, Damien. An important point. But I'm just typing out basically the way that I did the History Middle Earth stuff.
I'm not against it. I'm just saying.
And I'm not necessarily saying this is the only way to do it, but yeah.
And so I do think it's clear, at least.
You do get the idea of what I'm doing, right? I mean, this is
yeah.
Just because this makes it really, really clear whether you're in a. And notice I notice that the numbers continue, so it's not like there's a 1C and then a 1 and then a 2C and a 2C and a 2. It's just like it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I append a C to it just to make it clear. So that's one approach, right? I'm not saying it's the only approach. Another approach would be we just number them as sections. So in other words, the 8 lines above would just be 1, 2, 3, 4. Will be 1.001, 2.001, 2.002. So we drop the C. Another approach would be we just do paragraphs. How many paragraphs are there in 2? 1, 2, 5. So then the foregoing would become 006 and so on. I guess another approach is I don't continue the numbers. So I have a 1C, 001, then a 1, then a 2C.
So like I would suggest to go with the broader, easier approach. And then if we need to change things later, we can do so programmatically.
Yeah, like what doesn't lose information? Because you can always drop information. It's harder to get the information back. Yeah, which I think is true of what I've proposed.
Mm-hmm.
It would not be true, say, of just numbering the paragraphs, right? Just numbering the paragraphs doesn't contain the information about whether it's a commentary section or a manuscript quote section.
Yeah, I think for the sake of being able to cite what is actually on the book, what you proposed, James, is the closest thing to that.
It has the advantage if you don't care about whether it's a Christopher versus father, you can just ignore the C, right? And
you still have a progression.
You've still got the progression. You still know it's the first section, second section. And that number increments anytime you switch font size, basically.
Well, I think that's quite good. I quite like that.
And again, if that needs to change, we can do so programmatically. Just count, right?
Yeah, exactly. Good. Okay, so that's good because it's exactly the approach I adopted for History of Middle-earth. History of Middle-earth has some additional complexities, but let's not get into those now. Okay, I think like the LSR chapter section is similar. We may need to come back to the concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, but I just want to quickly raise the fact this is the first time I think we've hit multiple appendices. And I just want to highlight the fact that they're lettered.
Yeah.
So we probably want to call them like appendices, not appendix, appendices A dot like 002.
I would be consistent with appendix and then just say A.
It could be appendix A. It doesn't need to be appendices, does it?
Yeah.
Except that's what I mean, we called it notes, not note. That's the only.
Oh, okay.
Right, but footnote, we call it footnote.
Well, that word doesn't appear in the text, so I'm kind of
absolutely.
Yeah,
you're right.
I'm not etymological. I'm not disagreeing. I'm just throwing out possible.
No, you're right. Those are different categories. I changed my mind. I'm in favor. I'm convinced. Appendices is better.
Appendices is fine. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's clear. How would we handle the initial paragraphs? Are they
zeros again?
Even though it's quite long? Or
what do you mean by initial paragraph?
This bit up here.
Okay.
We can just use, depending on how we label the sections, we could just use paragraph numbers. Using the zero, my only problem with using the zero section is there's just a lot of paragraphs to do that. It's not like just one or two introductory paragraphs. It's like the main content.
Yeah, there's got to be about 15 paragraphs there at least.
Also, arguably, these alternate between.
They do.
So maybe we do need to adopt that 1C, 2, 3C approach here too.
Well, I think we should be consistent on that if you do use it. I think some consistency is needed.
The only thing is, and this again came up with History of Middle-earth, is sometimes it's an alternation between like a transcribed manuscript and Christopher's commentary. Other times it's like literally he's just quoting. Like in the case of the exiles were allowed to return, that's just a quote from a letter. It's not part of the text that he's commenting on. So I don't know whether to treat that the same or different.
That may be a separate problem for now.
Yeah.
It's sort of a source level type thing.
Yeah, it just seems different to me. Like if he's saying, in a letter in 1967, my father declared, is a different thing than here's manuscript B of the Tale of Eärendil. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Don't get me wrong. I'm totally for distinguishing the sources, but I'm not sure that we can necessarily address it now.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. The source information can be
right, because we also don't have a taxonomy, I think.
Yeah.
Of what happens there.
Yeah. We're over the 2 hours now. I don't know whether people want to continue. I mean, I feel like we're not quite there in terms of how to handle the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. Maybe there's a small amount of progress. Maybe there's progress we can make in a small amount of time to wrap things up.
I actually have to go.
Yep.
But it seems to me that like the rest of the text could be potentially already like, I think we should be fine with the rest of the text.
I do too. I just wonder, like, I feel like if we could answer just this one last question of how to do these initial paragraphs, and you can go if you need to go, Damien. Yeah. I don't want to keep you. But it seems like if we could just spend I'm not saying you have to stay, but the rest of us, if we could just spend 5-10 more minutes on those initial paragraphs of the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, then we may actually be good enough for me to put together a full proposal.
All right. See you, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, Damien.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Andrew and Kiara, you okay? Just
pressing
through.
I may have to leave in half an hour. But I'm good for now.
I'm hoping it's just another 10 minutes. So I'm not going to move on to any other chapters. But if we could just. This just seems so long to come up with to use the 0-0 approach, right? So if we call Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn 1, it just, I don't know, calling this 0-0 and this 0-1 and this 0-2 doesn't. I'm not sure that's any better than actually calling the first thing 1 and the next thing 2 and 3 and 4. Like there's nothing about Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn that says that it's the first section.
No, it's not. It's not an introduction beforehand, is it? It's just
right. That's sort of what I'm thinking. It's almost like the unheaded bits before are actually section 1, not section 0. I mean, it's a minor point. I don't think it really matters, but
Well, I suppose the first one is an introduction to them, isn't it? And then he's talking about a specific text that his father actually wrote. So I suppose it could be an introduction. You could say it was an introduction. You could describe it as that.
Yeah, it is. Although I think Kiara wouldn't want me to call it introduction, would you?
I mean, it depends. Like we're sort of working on the same line as what we did for Akalabeth. Because in Akalabeth, we had sort of the same problem, and then we invented this category of the epilogue. Right. Because, and this was at the end, not at the beginning, right. But we introduced that category because there was this section that was clearly separated from everything else, but it wasn't recognizable from anything, right. Editorially speaking.
Right. It was the issue. It was the issue that Andrew's brought up before of what do you do about paragraphs of text after the numbered notes, for example. It's a similar sort of thing. Yeah. Not
here.
Exactly
There is the added complexity that we know that there are subsections in the course of the chapter that we're dealing with because they're titled. So we know we treat them as subsection. So I guess the question is, do we treat the initial part of the history of Galadriel and Celeborn as an introduction? So we make a choice, we make a decision as to what that is, or we just communicate the text as it is flatly. And in that sense, those initial paragraphs would be just 0-1.
Right. So there is no part. Yeah. So just to pick this one, we know it starts with 3, 5, 3, 4, right? 3 or 4. Oops. So the question is, that's one possibility, right? We just straight top level. That raises problems of how on earth we distinguish the sections later on. So another alternative is we group this into a 0-0.
Yes.
Another possibility, which is we is that we really need to do this because we're going to alternate between Christopher and father, and this is a Christopher part. This is the first Christopher part. There'll probably be leading zeros there, but I won't worry about that now. Right, like these first two are inconsistent with the way we're doing concerning Galadriel and Celeborn. This one's actually the first one that's consistent. It just seems overly long for the first paragraph at a chapter level, but so this is leaning towards that. It makes logical, consistent sense, but is it too burdensome for the intuition of the user? Well, let me first of all ask: is it clear to the two of you why I'm proposing, why I'm proposing that?
Yes, it's clear to me, but I also do share your concern that it's quite complicated for the very first bit.
I don't know how to avoid that while maintaining the consistency with the Amroth and Nimrodel proposal. Right, because if you think about it, the corresponding first paragraph of the Amroth and Nimrodel looks the same, right? The first that is going to be 0-2, something like 0-2 1C 0 is going to be the I have.
Which case that's what it should be for this one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's any way to overcome the.
I think you should put it in like that for now, and then possibly if people don't like it, change it. But I think to begin with, that's the obvious one candidate to go for.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we can initially propose the most consistent logical system and have people complain. Sorry, Kiara, go on.
So I know that this is the work that you did for History of Middle-earth, and I think this is the way to go for us provisionally. But I am still not entirely sure that like the 1C and so on labels are what we want to go for eventually. Part of that is because if you want to cite I don't know, paragraphs 1 to 3 of section 1C in concerning whatever Amroth and Nimrodel. It's this, like, it's the same if you do 3.04, 02, 001 to 003, or if you add a 1C there. Right. It would change eventually if you change the if you introduce that section structurally, but that is not how the paragraphs progress in the edition. Like, we're introducing an additional level there, which in my opinion is more semantic than editorial. I will try to articulate this in such a way that it is clear from a philological standpoint. These are semantic labels that we're introducing in the text in the same way that they are editorially encoded with, a smaller size of the font and so on. There is definitely more than 2 because of the source problem that you were describing.
Sure.
And I'm not sure whether they should be structurally integrated in the citation system, or rather if we should use a sort of a concordance index later on. So to say 3.0402001 equals Christopher's editorial interventions.
So let me give a couple of thoughts on this. Some counterpoints, but also things I agree with the points you're raising.
Yeah, and I want to stress that I'm absolutely fine with going with that longer option for now, because as you said, it is much better for us to ditch information later rather than adding it afterwards.
So you you made one comment that I want to correct, and one that I actually find your argument compelling. So the one thing I do want to say correct, or not correct, but you talked about it being semantic rather than sort of, but I do want to point out it does exist as a structure in the XML. In other words, there is a div that I've put around Christopher's stuff and then Tolkien stuff. So it is structural, not just semantic, which is fine. There are other structures we skip in our citation system. So that's not itself an argument for including it. But I did want to make that point, that I do view it structural. The structural markup does actually distinguish the commentary from the manuscript quotations or transcriptions. But one of the compelling points you made is that we don't have a taxonomy yet, and we may not want to bake into the citation scheme this two-way alternation between commentary and non-commentary when there may be other things later on. So that's one disadvantage of having the C, is that it commits us to a particular way of thinking about it that may be too restrictive. I mean, we have plenty of other. Okay, here's another example that I think supports your argument. We don't, in the citation scheme, distinguish poetry from narrative. We have a separate field that I put on the chunk that says whether it's a paragraph or a stanza of poetry, or a letter or a heading or whatever. Right? That's not encoded in the referencing scheme. And so you could argue maybe commentary shouldn't be either.
Right. And also there's a problem with mixing things, because editorially, Christopher's interventions are distinguished from, let's say, the text. And by the text, I mean anything that he quotes or references, or the text itself. But then if we add another layer where we say he's quoting this letter, he's quoting this source, he's quoting, I don't know, this citation of this other source, we're making a decision there that is not editorially encoded in the books.
Right.
So again, there are levels of complexity here, which I'm not sure should be or can be addressed comprehensively in a citation system. And I'm wondering if there is a different way to do it.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. I mean, certainly one thing that we talked about during the Silmarillion discussion was you could start just by numbering paragraphs and not even have any high level structure, right? That's sort of one end of the spectrum, right? You just number all the paragraphs of the Silmarillion from 1 to 4,000 or whatever it is. That's not that much. I can tell you what it is. But actually I can, if I go to, if I go to the number of, where is it? Okay, so like it's somewhere between it's let's say 1,000 maybe. I'm summing these columns very quickly. So say it's 1,000, right? You could just number the paragraphs in the Silmarillion 1 to 1,000, and then you could separately layer on that the fact that Beren and Luthien is paragraphs, chapter 19 of the Quintus Silmarillion is paragraphs 700 to 800, right? You could do it that way, right? And we've decided not to go that extreme. We at least put in the chapters. But yeah, I mean, we're definitely here adopting more towards the other end of the spectrum, right? Of imputing structure on the text that is there in the XML. So it isn't. There's a basis for it in that sense structurally. Yeah.
I mean, again, this may not be our problem now, but eventually, I think it'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Especially if we want to go on distinguishing different types of sources that are not editorially distinguished in the books.
in the books. Well, certainly one of the things, and I talked very briefly about this at Mythmoot last year, one of the things that I do want to do, and Damien sort of alluded to this too, I do want us to have some sort of extraction of like if you want to get a particular manuscript out, or a particular story out, you're able to say, well, you need to grab these paragraphs and these paragraphs and these paragraphs and put them together. And we know we're missing something here, or whatever. But, you basically reconstruct. I think the point that I made at Mythmoot was that things like the History of Middle-earth, they're texts in their own right. And that's what we're trying to do a citation system for here. But they are also commentaries and selections from other documents that we want to be able to cite as well. So, yeah.
I still, as you talk, I'm increasingly seeing that problem as a concordance problem rather than a citation problem in itself.
Yep.
But again, it's not a conversation that we need to have now.
We don't have now. So I think what's good now is, I'm going to wrap things up now. This has been super helpful because I feel like now I've answered all the questions that were blocking me from putting together a proposal. I feel now like I can go away and put together a solid proposal rather than go, I didn't do that chapter because I got stuck with it. So my goal now, as an outcome of this, is I will actually propose a full citation system for Unfinished Tales. I will publish it like I did the Hobbit one, as like the initial 2 words or 2-3 words of every single citable chunk. And I'll make a note of anything if I hit any issues that we didn't talk about. Anything that I had to make a quick decision about. But I think we've got a tentative system here.
Yeah.
Which is really good. And yeah. I don't know if Andrew, if you have any closing thoughts.
No, I think we covered most of the areas that I felt needed to be covered.
Yep. Kiara, any closing thoughts?
I think we're in good shape for now.
Yeah. I guess one final thing that I do want us to think about is, how do I communicate on things like Search Tolkien the maturity or lack of different citation schemes? So there's a sense in which, if I type in Gandalf, the citation scheme for the 6 books of Lord of the Rings is almost set in stone. The appendices slightly less so, Silmarillion slightly less so, Unfinished Tales not at all. So I feel like at some point I need to communicate, hey, you're pretty safe using 3.01.034 as a citation, but be warned that we might change our minds about the Unfinished Tales.
Probably the best way to do that is just to have to update your citation system post regularly with the state of things, and maybe add something in that
version numbering on the citation schemes, so you can change the numbers. So you could have the Hobbit could be version 1, and then you could have version 2. If it's a very minor change, it's not going to affect anybody because they're not going to really notice it. But a bigger change, true. You might need to have a version number for the citation scheme.
Yep, that's true. Yeah. As well as the edition, right? We should always make clear what's the edition we're using, but also what's the version of the citation scheme. Yep, I agree. Excellent. Okay, well, I will stop sharing and wrap up now. I don't know. I haven't been checking the live stream comments.
We got a couple of people who joined late, so they're sort of catching up.
Lots to catch up on. Wow, we hit a peak of 11 simultaneous viewers, and quite a few people stayed to the end, which is wonderful. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. I hope this was interesting to people. I know that it's not the kind of normal thing that you would sit and watch on YouTube, but I wanted to kind of open, do a bit of a behind the scenes of the sorts of things that certainly Chiara and I talk about. And I admit this is actually a relatively short call for us, only two hours. We've done some 4-hour calls before.
We've done worse.
But I thank everyone for joining us, and definitely thank you, Andrew, and Chiara, and Damien, who had to go. This was really good. This was much more helpful than me fighting this for weeks. I never would have got it done. Okay, well, I'll say goodbye now, and look forward to, well, you can look forward to a blog post or two about this stuff, and we'll see how we go with this is our first video on the Digital Tolkien YouTube channel too. So we'll see how that goes. We'll do some shorter videos too, I promise. They won't all be 2.5 hours long. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, I've ended.